Tushar Borah finds peace in the precise rituals of his quiet bungalow until Oindrila Saikia arrives from the city, seeking to shed her urban restlessness. Together they discover the slow art of orchid tea and the tender memories hidden in old photographs. Listen as they navigate the delicate space between solitude and affection in a sanctuary of mist and memory. The rhythm of the mist. The microfiber cloth caught the light as Tushar Borah rotated his glasses in a steady, circular motion. To rush was to invite a smudge, and a smudge was a distortion of the world. He held the frames up to the dim light, ensuring the glass was a perfect, invisible void. In the corner, the grandfather clock anchored the silence, its pendulum swinging with a metal-sharp thrum that echoed the tracks he had managed for 30 years. For Tushar, time was not a river, but a sequence of precise intervals. He moved to the sideboard. With a hand that had once signaled locomotives to a halt with a single gesture, he began to arrange porcelain cups on a rosewood tray. He placed the first, then the second, ensuring the distance between them was exactly an inch. The click of ceramic meeting wood was a tiny percussion in the stillness. He adjusted the third cup by a fraction of a millimeter. The ritual was a shield. As long as the objects were in their proper place, the internal architecture of his life remained stable. Tushar pushed open the heavy mahogany window. The hinge gave a guttural groan, and the scent of rain on dry dust, the sharp, metal-sharp smell of the Assam highlands, flooded the room. It was a scent that settled in the chest, carrying the weight of the mountains and the dampness of the tea gardens. He inhaled deeply, letting the humidity cling to his skin. This was the only constant, while the world outside the valley accelerated into a blur of digital noise. Here, the rain took its time. He glanced at the clock, 4012 p.m. The precision was a phantom limb that still twitched. In the railway service, a deviation of 30 seconds could be a catastrophe. In retirement, it was merely a preference. Yet he still synced his heartbeat to the pendulum. He wondered if he had spent so long observing the schedule of others that he had forgotten how to exist without one. On the side table lay a heavy iron key, its surface pitted and cold. Tushar traced the jagged teeth of the metal. It was a relic from the old station house, once used to guard logs and telegraphs. To Tushar, the key was a physical manifestation of the lock he had placed upon his own heart, a rusted bolt keeping the longing for the past tucked away in a dark room. He walked onto the porch, slippers scuffing the stone. The valley was disappearing. Mist rolled in from the east, a slow-motion tide of opaque white that swallowed the foothills and erased the boundary between earth and sky. He leaned against the railing, the damp air cooling his skin. From this height, the silence was a heavy blanket, muffling the distant calls of hornbills and the rustle of orchid vines. As he watched the fog, a sharp friction sparked in his mind. He looked back at the interior of his bungalow, the aligned cups, the polished glasses, the rhythmic clock, and felt a sudden, claustrophobic surge. He had spent years sculpting this solitude, carving away every jagged edge of spontaneity. But as the white fog pressed against the porch, the stillness felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. He had built a world where nothing could hurt him, but also one where nothing could reach him. He stayed there, suspended between a desire for the silence and a terrifying fear of it. He had become a curator of his own loneliness, polishing it until it shone. The thought of another decade of this empty rhythm made his breath catch. He wanted to break the alignment of the cups. He wanted to let the clock run down until the pendulum stopped. Then the silence was punctured. It began as a vibration in the soles of his feet, a low hum that didn't belong to the wind. It was an internal combustion engine struggling against the steep incline of the hillside path. Tushar froze. No one visited the bungalow unannounced. The road was a treacherous ribbon of gravel and mud that discouraged casual travelers. He squinted through the haze. The hum grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on wet stone. A flash of urban silver emerged from the white curtain. The car slowed, its engine idling with a rhythmic chug that disrupted the peace of the valley. Tushar stood perfectly still, his heart performing a heavy thud against his ribs, a rhythm that defied the precision of his clock. The car door creaked open. A woman stepped out, her silhouette blurred by the fog. She wore a coat too thin for the Highland chill, and she stood for a moment looking up at the house, her head tilted like a question. Tushar felt the iron key in his pocket grow warm against his thigh. He recognized that tilt of the head. He recognized the restless energy that belonged to the city, yet felt instinctively familiar. He descended the porch steps slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. The scent of rain was now mixed with exhaust and something floral, a hint of night bloom that didn't belong in the mist. He stopped a few feet away from her, the distance between them filled with the ghosts of 40 years. Oindrila Saikia looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the boy she had left behind in the tea gardens. She smiled, a tentative movement that didn't quite reach her eyes, which shimmered with hesitation and hope. She simply traced the line of his jaw with her gaze, noting the silver in his hair and the meditative stillness of his posture. Tushar opened his mouth, but the words felt like stones he had to lift from a riverbed. He wanted to ask why she had come, or how she had found the path through the fog, but the habit of silence was powerful. He simply nodded and adjusted his glasses. Oindrila tilted her head, her voice soft and melodic. "You still keep the time exactly the same, don't you, Tushar?" The shedding of noise. Oindrila stepped out of the silver car, and the Highland air hit her like a wet sheet, cold and smelling of crushed ferns. She didn't move at first. She stood by the open door, her chest rising and falling in short, shallow bursts. Her pulse was still timed to the frantic strobe of city traffic, the relentless cadence of sirens and deadlines that had followed her all the way up the winding gravel road. Even here, in the thick white silence of the Assam hills, her mind was a humming wire, vibrating with the phantom noise of 1,000 unseen notifications. She felt as if she were still moving at 80 kilometers per hour, though her feet were planted on damp stone. She began to walk toward the bungalow, and the sound of her heels, sharp synthetic clicks, echoed against the fog. The noise felt violent, a series of small explosions that punctured the muffled peace of the valley. Each step felt like an intrusion. She watched the mist swirl around her ankles, thick and opaque, swallowing the ground beneath her. The bungalow loomed through the gray, a structure of dark wood and wide eaves that seemed to have grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. It looked heavy, settled, and utterly indifferent to the passage of time. Tushar remained where he was, his figure a steady anchor in the drifting white. He didn't rush forward to bridge the gap. He simply stood, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, watching her approach with a gaze that was neither demanding nor distant. When she finally stopped a few feet away, the silence between them stretched, thick and weighted. It was a silence that didn't need filling. It was a space he had curated for decades, and he invited her into it without a single word. "You look tired, Oindrila," he said. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the chest rather than the throat. He paused, the gap in his speech lasting long enough for a bird to call from the hidden canopy of a nearby banyan tree. "The road is long. The city is longer." Oindrila opened her mouth to reply, to offer a polished excuse about the traffic or the winding turns of the mountain pass, but the words died in her throat. There was something in his steady, unblinking gaze, a quiet acceptance, that made her rehearsed lines feel absurd. He didn't reach out to hug her, which would have felt too sudden, too disruptive to the equilibrium of the porch. Instead, he gave a slow, rhythmic nod, a silent confirmation that she had arrived and that the arrival was sufficient. As she crossed the threshold into the house, the scent changed. The dampness of the mist was replaced by the smell of old paper, beeswax, and a faint, lingering trace of dried orange peel. Instinctively, Oindrila paused at the door and slid off her heels. The act felt like a shedding of skin. As her bare soles touched the floor, she gasped softly. The wooden planks were wide, honey-colored, and held a deep, radiating warmth that seemed to seep directly into her bones. She shifted her weight, feeling the grain of the wood, the slight dip in the floor where thousands of footsteps had pressed over the years. It was a tactile grounding that made her feel, for the first time in months, that she was actually touching the earth. Her hand drifted to the pocket of her coat, her fingers searching for the cold glass of her phone. It was a reflex, a phantom limb. She pulled the device out and held it aloft, searching for a bar of signal, a single flicker of connectivity to the world she had just escaped. The screen remained stubbornly blank of any network icon. No bars, no LTE, no tether. A sudden, sharp spike of anxiety flared in her gut, a visceral fear of being unreachable, of the void where her digital identity usually resided. What happens if the world stops noticing me? She wondered. The thought was an intrusive, jagged thing. She imagined her emails piling up like autumn leaves, the frantic pings of colleagues turning into a silence that might eventually become permanent. She felt a strange, floating sensation, as if the loss of the signal had physically detached her from the ground. She was no longer a professional, a botanical illustrator, a citizen of a bustling metropolis. She was simply a woman standing in a quiet house in the hills, stripped of her armor. The silence of the room began to press against her ears, and for a moment the emptiness felt like a threat. Tushar appeared beside her, his movements fluid and devoid of urgency. He didn't comment on the phone in her hand, though he likely saw the desperation in her grip. Instead, he held out a simple glass of water. The water was clear, with tiny bubbles clinging to the sides of the glass, and it looked impossibly cold. "Drink," he said, the word a slow invitation. He didn't move to take the phone from her, nor did he ask her to put it away. He simply stood there, his head tilting in that slow, rhythmic nod, encouraging her to exist in the present second. Oindrila took the glass, her fingers brushing his. A brief, cool contact that felt like a spark of electricity. She drank the water in slow gulps, feeling the liquid slide down her throat, cooling the heat of her anxiety. As she did, she noticed the way Tushar watched her, not with judgment, but with a patient, observational stillness, as if he were watching a storm slowly blow itself out. Setting the glass down on a side table, Oindrila leaned her shoulder against the heavy mahogany doorframe. She let her gaze wander across the room, moving past the neatly organized bookshelves and the brass clocks that ticked in a synchronized heartbeat rhythm. Her eyes caught on a small, framed sketch pinned to the wall near the hallway. She stepped closer, her breath hitching. It was a botanical study of a rare orchid, the lines fine and precise, capturing the delicate curl of the petal and the intricate veins of the leaf. The style was hauntingly familiar. It mirrored the exact shorthand she used in her own journals, the same way of suggesting volume through a series of light hatching strokes. She traced the air in front of the drawing with her fingertip, wondering when he had acquired it, or if he had kept it all these years. The realization that he had preserved a piece of art that spoke her language felt like a bridge being extended across the 40-year chasm. She looked back at Tushar, who was now slowly polishing his glasses with a piece of soft linen, his expression unreadable. He paused his cleaning and looked up at her. The stern, retired station master facade softened, and for the first time a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of triumph or surprise, but one of recognition. It was the smile of a man who had kept a place set at the table, who had known the trajectory of the wind and the timing of the seasons, and who had simply been waiting for the inevitable return of a long-lost friend. Oindrila felt the last of the city's tension break, leaving her feeling light and dangerously vulnerable. She studied the empty hallway, then back at the man who had become a stranger and a sanctuary all at once. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, a heavy rhythmic thud echoed from the floor above, followed by the distinct sound of something metal-sharp sliding across the wood, as if a heavy chest had been pushed across the room by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Golden steam. Tushar froze, his hand still gripping the linen cloth. The sound had been precise, a heavy weight meeting floorboards, followed by the screech of metal on wood. Oindrila had stepped back, her shoulder hitting the mahogany frame with a soft thud. For a long moment, the only sound in the bungalow was the synchronized ticking of the brass clocks, a rhythmic heartbeat that suddenly felt too fast. Tushar didn't move. He tilted his head, listening to the silence that followed. The house was old, prone to settling in the damp highland air, but this had been an event, not a sigh of timber. He watched Oindrila. Her eyes were wide, the city-bred anxiety returning to the set of her jaw. He didn't tell her it was nothing. He simply stepped toward the stairs, his movements measured, as if he were still signaling trains through a fog. They reached the upper landing just as the front door downstairs clicked open and shut. The noise hadn't come from an intruder, but from the house reacting to a sudden shift in pressure, or perhaps a heavy book slipping from a shelf in the attic room. Tushar entered the upper chamber to find a stack of old railway ledgers had tipped over, the metal binding of the top volume having slid across the floor. He righted the books with a slow, methodical grace, his face remaining a mask of calm. Oindrila let out a breath that sounded like a whistle. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted, transforming from fear into a fragile, shared curiosity. "You keep a museum up here," Oindrila said, her voice lifting at the end, a soft question. She stepped further into the room, her fingers hovering over the spines of the ledgers. "I keep a record," Tushar replied, his voice low and resonant. He paused, the silence stretching between them like a physical cord. The world moves too quickly. Records are the only things that stay still. They descended the stairs together, the air in the hallway smelling of old paper and damp cedar. As they reached the kitchen, they found Lobsang Searing already there, standing by the heavy oak table. He had entered through the side door, a ghost in saffron and wool, his movements so fluid they seemed to displace no air. In his arms, he cradled a bundle of rare, fragrant orchids, their petals a bruised, deep violet that looked almost black in the dim light of the kitchen. Lobsang didn't speak immediately. He simply blinked, a slow, mindful motion, and placed the flowers on the table. The scent hit them instantly, a heady, metal-sharp sweetness that cut through the smell of rain. "The mist is thick today," Lobsang whispered, his voice airy and light, carrying a permanent hint of a smile. "The orchids are heavy with it. They are ready." Tushar nodded slowly, a rhythmic acknowledgement. He began to prepare the tea, but Lobsang stepped forward, his hands tucked into his wide sleeves. He didn't take over, but his presence became a guide. "The rule of 3, Tushar," the monk murmured. "The water must reach a simmer, not a boil. The leaves must steep in silence, and the scent must be inhaled before the first sip. To rush the tea is to drink only hot water and missed opportunities." Oindrila watched the process, her fingers drumming a restless beat against the edge of the table. In the city, tea was a catalyst for meetings, a beverage swallowed in paper cups while walking toward a subway entrance. Here, the silence was oppressive. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, her gaze darting from the simmering pot to the clock on the wall. The slow drip of the water, the deliberate way Tushar measured the dried orchid petals, the excruciating pause as they waited for the steep. It felt like a challenge. She felt a prickle of irritation, a phantom itch of a phone notification that wasn't there. She wanted to ask Lobsang about the orchids, to ask Tushar about the 40 years, to fill the void with words. But the monk's steady, blinking gaze seemed to anchor her to the floor, demanding she exist in the stillness. The serenity was shattered by the sound of a car slamming a door outside, followed by the heavy, hurried stride of a person who viewed a hallway as a hurdle. Siddharth Hazarika burst into the room without knocking, his presence a sudden, jagged tear in the atmosphere. He was dressed in a crisp, ironed shirt that looked absurdly formal for the Highlands, and he was checking a silver pocket watch with a frequency that bordered on a tick. "Tushar, I've just come from the lower slopes," Siddharth began, his voice crisp and fast, the words colliding into one another. "The harvest is a disaster. The yield is down 15% because the pickers are spending half their time chatting under the shade trees. It's an inefficiency nightmare. If we implemented a timed quota system..." Siddharth stopped, finally noticing Oindrila and Lobsang. He didn't slow down, but he did pause to offer a sharp, professional nod. "Oindrila, I didn't know you'd returned. A surprise, though perhaps a timely one. We need someone with an eye for detail to look at the logistics of the new processing plant." Siddharth continued to speak, his voice filling the room like a leak in a pipe. He talked of throughput, of modernization, of the stagnation of the valley's old ways. He paced the small kitchen, his shoes clicking sharply on the tiles, creating a frantic counterpoint to the slow simmer of the tea. Lobsang simply blinked. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, and didn't acknowledge the urgency. He stood like a stone in a stream, letting Siddharth's words flow around him and vanish into the walls. Tushar, meanwhile, ignored the chatter entirely. He didn't look at his cousin. His focus was narrowed to a singular point, the golden steam rising from the porcelain pot. He waited for the exact second the color shifted from a pale straw to a deep, luminous amber. With a slow, deliberate motion, he poured the tea into 3 small cups. The sound of the liquid filling the porcelain was the only thing that mattered. "Siddharth," Tushar said, his voice low and heavy, cutting through the noise. "Drink." It wasn't a request, it was a command of stillness. Siddharth hesitated, his hand still hovering over his pocket watch, but the aroma of the orchid tea reached him, a scent that smelled of ancient earth and cold mountain air. He took the cup, his fingers trembling slightly from the residual energy of his drive. As Siddharth took the first sip, the world seemed to contract. The sensory zoom was absolute, the heat of the porcelain against his fingertips, the initial bitter tang of the orchid, followed by a sudden blooming sweetness that coated the tongue and slid down the throat like liquid silk. For a moment, the noise of the processing plants and the quotas vanished. Siddharth's shoulders, which had been hiked up to his ears, visibly dropped. His chest expanded in a long, slow breath. The fast-paced rhythm of his speech faltered, then stopped. He studied the tea, then at Tushar, his expression momentarily vacant of ambition. Lobsang stepped back toward the door, his presence receding as quickly as it had arrived. He paused at the threshold, the mist already curling around his ankles. "Harmony is not the absence of noise," he whispered, a final piece of wisdom cast into the room. "It is the ability to hear the silence beneath it. But be careful. The silence of the valley is a fragile thing. Once broken, it takes a lifetime to mend." With a mindful blink, Lobsang vanished back into the white shroud of the highlands. The room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Heavier, charged with the lingering scent of orchids and the unspoken weight of the 40-year gap between Tushar and Oindrila. Siddharth sat in the chair, staring into his cup, the urgency gone, replaced by a sudden jarring awareness of how quiet the house had become. Oindrila looked at Tushar, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something like apprehension in his eyes, as if Lobsang's warning had planted a seed of doubt about the peace they had just found. The fragile archive. Falguni Borah was already there, a permanent fixture in the sunroom like the heavy mahogany sideboard or the dust motes dancing in the slanted light. She sat in her high-backed wicker chair, the rhythmic creak-snap of the rockers providing a metronome for the afternoon. Her shawl, a heavy weave of indigo and crimson, was draped precariously over one shoulder, and she didn't look up as they entered, merely lifted a gnarled hand in a vague, welcoming gesture. The room smelled of dried eucalyptus and the faint, sharp tang of the coming rain. "You've taken your time," Falguni said, her voice a low, rough rumble that sounded like river stones grinding together in a current. "The tea has likely gone cold, but the memories are still warm enough." On the low table between them lay a weathered leather album, its spine cracked and peeling like old birch bark. As Tushar stepped forward to clear a space for the others, Falguni opened the cover. A cloud of scent bloomed upward, the vanilla sweetness of decaying lignin and the sharp, dry smell of old glue. It was the smell of a closed room, of things kept in the dark to prevent them from fading. Oindrila felt a sudden, sharp tug in her chest, a physical pull toward the yellowed pages that seemed to vibrate with the weight of everything they hadn't spoken about for 4 decades. Oindrila leaned in, her shoulder nearly brushing Tushar's. She found a photograph of 2 children standing by a rusted railway signal, their faces smudged with dirt and triumph. The edges of the print were brittle, curling upward like dried leaves. She reached out to touch it, but stopped her fingertip a fraction of a millimeter from the surface. The paper looked so fragile that a single misplaced breath might shatter the image into 1,000 gray shards. She realized then that the memory wasn't a solid thing. It was a thin membrane, a precarious bridge across a gap that had grown too wide to jump. "Tushar used to believe he could talk to the trains," Falguni murmured, her rocking motion slowing but never stopping. "He'd stand there for hours, convinced that if he listened to the vibration in the rails, he could tell exactly which station the engine had left and whether the driver was in a foul mood. He had a devotion to rhythm that bordered on the religious. And Oindrila was the one who taught the birds to stay still for her sketches. I remember a July afternoon when the heat was so thick you could carve it, and she spent 4 hours drawing a single kingfisher. She wouldn't move a muscle, not even to swat the flies from her neck." Falguni's voice drifted, meandering through the decades. She spoke of the monsoon of '62, of the way the valley had once smelled of wild ginger and damp earth, and how the laughter of children had once been the primary soundtrack of the highlands. Her stories didn't follow a straight line. They looped and circled, bridging the current heavy silence between Tushar and Oindrila with the ghost of their childhood noise. Tushar listened, his gaze fixed on the album, his expression unreadable. He didn't contribute to the story, but his presence had shifted. He had moved his chair closer to Oindrila, the distance between them now barely a hand's breadth. Siddharth sat in the armchair opposite them, his posture an anomaly. The man who had arrived like a wound, tense, jagged, and hurried, was now sunk deep into the velvet cushions. His legs were stretched out, his ankles crossed, and for the first time his hand stayed away from his pocket watch. He wasn't checking the time or calculating the efficiency of the conversation. He was simply listening, his eyes half closed, absorbing the rough cadence of Falguni's voice as if it were a sedative. The urban urgency that had defined him had evaporated, leaving behind a quiet, bewildered stillness. "There is a particular kind of silence that comes after a long absence," Falguni said, her eyes twinkling beneath heavy lids. "It is not a void, it is a vessel. It holds everything you forgot to say, and everything you were too afraid to keep." Oindrila turned the page, the paper giving a dry, protesting rasp. Near the back of the album, tucked behind a fold of parchment, she found a photograph she didn't recognize. It was a shot of a hidden garden, a sanctuary of overgrown ferns and white lilies that seemed to glow against a backdrop of deep, mossy green. The composition was haphazard, the lighting dim, but the atmosphere was one of absolute seclusion. "The hidden cloister," Oindrila whispered. Her voice had a slight lift, a question hanging in the air. She studied Tushar. "You mentioned this in your letters. The garden where the air tastes like honey. You said you'd take me there one day, but then you stopped writing about it." Tushar didn't answer immediately. He reached up and slowly polished his glasses with a piece of soft flannel, a rhythmic, obsessive motion that shielded him from the directness of her gaze. When he finally put them back on, his eyes were clouded. He wanted to speak. Oindrila could see it in the way his throat tightened, the way his jaw set, but the words remained locked behind the wall of his habitual solitude. He had spent 40 years perfecting the art of the unspoken, and the sudden requirement to be vulnerable was a language he had forgotten how to speak. "It is overgrown now," Tushar finally said, his voice low and resonant, the pauses between the words stretching like taffy. "The ferns have reclaimed the paths, the honey is gone." "But the garden is still there," Oindrila countered softly. She shifted her hand, laying her palm flat on the page next to the photo. It was an invitation, a bridge extended across the chasm. Slowly, as if moving through water, Tushar placed his hand beside hers. He didn't grip her fingers or attempt a bold gesture of affection. He simply let his skin touch hers. Oindrila felt the contact as a sudden electric sensory zoom. The world narrowed down to the precise point where their skin met. She felt the rough, calloused texture of his palm, the skin of a man who had spent his life handling iron and tea leaves against her own smoother, ink-stained fingers. She noticed a tremor in his hand. It wasn't a shake of age or illness, but a fine, rhythmic shudder, a vibration of suppressed emotion so intense that it bypassed his voice and manifested in his muscles. It was the sound of a dam straining against a flood, a physical admission of the longing he refused to articulate. For a long moment they stayed like that, anchored to each other by a brittle photograph and a trembling hand. The only sound in the room was the creak snap of Falguni's chair and the distant, mournful cry of a hillbird. The silence was no longer heavy, it was expectant. "I think," Siddharth said, his voice now soft and devoid of its usual crispness, "that I would like to see this garden." Falguni let out a dry, wheezing chuckle. "The garden does not accept guests, Siddharth. It only accepts those who know how to be still." As Oindrila looked back at the photo, she noticed something she had missed. In the corner of the image, partially obscured by a fern leaf, was a small, metal-sharp object, a brass key resting on a stone plinth. She frowned, the memory of the heavy thud and the sliding metal-sharp sound from the upper floor of the bungalow suddenly rushing back to her. She looked up at Tushar, whose hand was still trembling against hers, and wondered if the secrets of the house were mirrored in the secrets of the valley. The sanctuary of Bihu. The floorboards didn't just carry the sound, they carried the pulse. It began as a subterranean tremor, a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the soles of Oindrila's feet and traveled upward, settling in the marrow of her bones. The Bihu drums had started in the valley, a distant, collective heartbeat that signaled the arrival of the festival. It was a sound that demanded movement, yet as Oindrila stood in the center of the living room, she felt a strange, heavy inertia. The air in the bungalow remained thick with the scent of Lobsang's orchids and the lingering ghost of the tea ritual, a sanctuary of stillness that now felt fragile, as if the approaching noise of the festivities might shatter it like thin glass. Tushar was already moving toward the porch, his gait slow and deliberate. Oindrila followed him, the wooden planks creaking under her weight in a familiar, comforting cadence. As they stepped outside, the evening mist of the Assam highlands surged forward to meet them, a cool, damp shroud that clung to their skin and dampened the fabric of her cotton sari. The temperature had dropped sharply, the kind of sudden mountain chill that made the warmth of the interior feel like a memory of another life. They stood together on the wide, weathered porch, the gray wood silvered by decades of rain and sun, watching the valley dissolve into a sea of opaque white. Below them, the village had become a constellation of flickering orange lamps, small points of light fighting against the encroaching fog. The drums grew louder, the percussion blending with the high, melodic wail of the pepa, the buffalo hornpipe which sliced through the mist in long, mournful arcs. Oindrila leaned against the railing, her fingers tracing a deep gouge in the timber where the wood had split years ago. She felt the restlessness of the city still humming in her veins, but it was different now. It wasn't the frantic anxiety of deadlines and traffic, but a mourning for the version of herself that had lived in the noise. She wondered if that woman was gone, or if she was merely sleeping, waiting for the return trip to the city to wake her up. "Do you think I can go back?" Oindrila asked. Her voice was a soft, melodic question that seemed to hang in the damp air, barely audible over the distant music. She didn't look at Tushar. Instead, she watched a single droplet of condensation slide down the railing, carving a clear path through the dust. "The city feels like a garment that no longer fits. I fear that if I return, I will simply be pretending to be the person I used to be, while my heart stays here, trapped in the mist." Tushar did not answer immediately. He never did. He stood beside her, his presence a steady, grounding weight. He reached up to polish his glasses with a slow, rhythmic motion, the cloth whispering against the lens. The silence stretched, not as a void, but as a space he was carefully preparing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and resonant, vibrating in the small gap between them. The pauses between his words were like the breaths of the valley itself. "The city is a place of arrivals and departures," Tushar said, his voice carrying the weight of the station master he once was. "But this house, this valley, it is a place of staying. For 40 years, I thought the stillness was the goal. I thought the silence was the prize." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the mountains vanished into the gray. "I was wrong. The silence was only a waiting room. This sanctuary, it is only complete because you are standing in it." Oindrila felt a sudden, sharp pressure in her chest, a physical reaction to the admission that bypassed her mind and landed straight in her lungs. She turned to him, her head tilting slightly, her eyes searching his face for the flicker of a joke or the shield of irony. There was none. Tushar's expression was as open and honest as the landscape around them. He didn't move toward her with a grand gesture. He simply opened his hand, palm up, in a silent invitation. Oindrila slid her hand into his. His skin was rough, the calluses of a lifetime of manual labor and archival work pressing against her smoother palm. It wasn't a grip of possession, but one of mutual anchoring. The physical connection acted as a sensory bridge, replacing the need for any further elaborate confession. In the interlocking of their fingers, there was a shared history of missed opportunities and quiet endurance, a silent agreement that the years spent apart had been a long, winding road leading precisely to this porch, in this mist, at this exact moment of the festival. From the shadow of the doorway, Siddharth Hazarika watched them. He had been leaning against the doorframe, his pocket watch forgotten in his hand, the gold chain dangling uselessly. For the first time since his arrival, the tension in his shoulders had vanished. He studied the couple, the retired station master and the artist, and felt a strange, humbling sense of inadequacy. He had spent his entire career optimizing the harvest, trimming the seconds off the process, treating time as a resource to be mined. But looking at the stillness Tushar and Oindrila shared, he realized that efficiency was a poor substitute for presence. He saw that some things, the most important things, were only revealed when one stopped trying to accelerate them. Siddharth stepped back quietly into the house, leaving them to their silence. He didn't want to interrupt the frequency they had found, a frequency that existed beneath the noise of the drums. He felt a sudden urge to put away his watch, to let the hours bleed into one another without the tyranny of a ticking hand. As the night deepened, the scent of the blooming orchids drifted up from the garden, mixing with the pungent, sweet smell of the festive oil lamps being lit in the village below. The fragrance was heavy and intoxicating, a grounding loop that tethered them to the earth. The mist seemed to thicken, curling around the porch pillars like ghostly fingers, isolating the bungalow from the rest of the world. It felt as though they had stepped off the map entirely, entering a space where time had no jurisdiction. Oindrila leaned her head against Tushar's shoulder, the fabric of his linen shirt smelling of old paper and cedar wood. The distant drums grew louder, the rhythm becoming more insistent, calling the people of the valley to dance and celebrate the coming of spring. It was a roar of life, a chaotic, joyful noise that usually would have triggered the restlessness in her spirit. But here, held in the steady grip of Tushar's hand, the noise felt distant, as if it were happening in another dimension. They remained perfectly still, two figures carved from the same piece of quiet. The Bihu festival raged in the valley, a whirlwind of color and sound, but on the porch of the Highland bungalow, the air remained undisturbed. They had reached a silent agreement, a pact sealed not with words, but with the warmth of their skin and the shared rhythm of their breathing. They would never let the noise return to this space. The sanctuary was no longer just a house or a valley, it was the stillness they found in each other. As the last of the orange lanterns began to fade into the thickening fog, Oindrila noticed a small, metal-sharp glint on the side table near the door, the brass key from the photograph which Tushar had quietly placed there. It sat beside a small bowl of orchid petals, a reminder that while the piece was profound, there were still locks to be turned and gardens to be rediscovered. The drums continued to beat, a steady heart for the hills, but as Tushar squeezed her hand, Oindrila knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.